In the shadowed corridors of Madrid's royal palace, where whispered scandals echo through marble halls and royal secrets fester like open wounds, there lived a king whose very name would become synonymous with depravity, betrayal, and shame. This is the story of Ferdinand VII of Spain, a monarch whose most humiliating secret would shock even the most jaded courtiers of 19th century Europe. What you're about to discover isn't just another tale of royal excess. This is the extraordinary chronicle of how one man's grotesque physical abnormality, combined with his moral bankruptcy, would bring an entire empire to its knees. Ferdinand VII wasn't merely Spain's worst king. He was Europe's most perverted ruler, harboring a secret so mortifying that it required special furniture just to consummate his marriages. Born on October 14, 1784, in the vast palace of El Escorial, Ferdinand entered a world already poisoned by corruption and deceit. His father, Charles IV, was a weak-willed monarch who preferred hunting to governing. His mother, Maria Luisa of Parma, was conducting a scandalous affair with Manuel Godoy, the court's most despised favorite. Young Ferdinand grew up watching his mother's lover essentially rule Spain, while his father remained willfully blind to both his wife's infidelity and his kingdom's decay. But Ferdinand's childhood trauma ran deeper than mere parental neglect. From his earliest years, those closest to him noticed something unusual about the young prince, something that would later require the most extraordinary accommodations. As Ferdinand matured, palace physicians made a shocking discovery. The future king possessed what contemporary accounts described as a member thin as a stick of sealing wax at its base, thick as a fist on his limb, and as long as a billiard cue. This wasn't the blessing that modern sensibilities might assume. In 19th century Spain, influenced by ancient Greek ideals of physical perfection, Ferdinand's grotesque endowment was considered monstrous. The young prince's anatomy was so bizarrely proportioned that intimate relations would prove nearly impossible without mechanical assistance. Palace craftsmen were secretly commissioned to create a special cushion, a device that would support the narrow base of his member, while leaving only the bulbous tip accessible for his unfortunate wives. Ferdinand's physical abnormality was matched only by his moral deformity. Excluded from government by his parents and their lover Godoy, the prince festered with resentment and ambition. He began plotting against his own family, encouraged by his tutor José Escoiquiz, a conservative cleric who filled Ferdinand's mind with absolutist ideology and dreams of revenge. In October 1807, Ferdinand's treachery was exposed in what became known as the El Escorial conspiracy. The prince had been secretly corresponding with Napoleon Bonaparte, seeking the French emperor's support to overthrow his own father. When Charles IV discovered his son's betrayal, Ferdinand groveled pathetically, throwing his fellow conspirators to the wolves and begging his parents' forgiveness on his knees. But Ferdinand's humiliation was far from over. In March 1808, popular riots forced Charles IV to abdicate in favor of his son. For a brief, shining moment, Ferdinand VII was king. The Spanish people, desperate for change, hailed him as El Deseado, the desired one. They believed this young monarch would save them from Godoy's corruption and restore Spain's glory. They could not have been more wrong. Napoleon, the master manipulator, summoned both Ferdinand and his father to Bayonne, France, under the pretense of mediating their family dispute. Like lambs to slaughter, both Spanish royals traveled to meet the emperor. There, in one of history's most shameful episodes, Napoleon forced both father and son to renounce their claims to the Spanish throne. Ferdinand, the man who had conspired with foreign powers against his own family, now found himself a prisoner of those very same foreigners. For 6 years, while Spain bled in the Peninsular War, Ferdinand lived in gilded captivity at the Château de Valençay. But rather than suffering nobly for his people, Ferdinand collaborated enthusiastically with his captors. He congratulated Napoleon on victories over Spanish forces and even expressed his desire to become the emperor's adopted son. The desired king was revealed as nothing more than a coward and a traitor. Meanwhile, his first wife, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily, endured her own private hell. Married to Ferdinand in 1802, she quickly discovered the horrifying reality of her husband's character and anatomy. Her mother, Queen Marie Caroline, wrote devastatingly about her daughter's plight. The Prince of Asturias has an ugly face, a tubby figure, round knees and legs, a piping, delicate voice, and is utterly stupid. Though he is physically amorous, they are not yet husband and wife after sleeping together a week. Maria Antonia's letters home were heartbreaking. "Mother, you have been deceived, for you are too good a mother to have sacrificed me like this if you had known." The young princess endured 2 miscarriages before dying mysteriously in 1806, at just 21 years old. Rumors swirled that she had been poisoned, and when the palace apothecary committed suicide, leaving behind a seized letter, the conspiracy theories only intensified. In 1814, Ferdinand returned to Spain as a supposed hero. The Spanish people, who had fought and died in his name during the War of Independence, expected their desired king to honor the liberal constitution of Cadiz that had been written in his absence. Instead, Ferdinand revealed his true nature. Within weeks of his return, he abolished the constitution, arrested liberal leaders, and restored the absolute monarchy with a vengeance. The man who had groveled before Napoleon now turned his cruelty on his own subjects. He reinstated the Spanish Inquisition, closed the free press, and launched a witch hunt against anyone who had supported constitutional government. Spain, which had briefly glimpsed the possibility of democratic reform, was plunged back into medieval darkness. Ferdinand's second marriage, to his own niece Maria Isabel of Portugal in 1816, brought fresh horrors. The arrangement had been proposed by an unknown friar, a detail that speaks to the desperate measures required to find Ferdinand a wife. Maria Isabel, described by courtiers as encouraging Ferdinand's worst impulses, shared his love for destroying constitutional government and using force against their subjects. But their attempts to produce an heir were tragic failures. Their first daughter died at 5 months old. When Maria Isabel became pregnant again, the birth was a nightmare. The baby was stillborn and breech, and doctors, believing the queen was also dead, began performing a cesarean section to extract the infant. Suddenly, Maria Isabel screamed. She was still alive. The 21-year-old queen bled to death that same day, another victim of Ferdinand's cursed reign. Ferdinand's third marriage, to 16-year-old Maria Josefa Amalia of Saxony in 1819, revealed the full extent of his depravity. The innocent princess, raised in strict religious isolation, had no idea what awaited her on her wedding night. When Ferdinand appeared naked in her chambers, displaying his monstrous anatomy, Maria Josefa fled the room screaming. She refused to return until Ferdinand's sister-in-law begged her to fulfill her duties. The wedding night was a disaster. Maria Josefa was so terrified that she soiled herself before the marriage could be consummated. Ferdinand, showing no patience or understanding, forced the encounter anyway. Afterward, the traumatized queen refused intimate relations for months, believing that any physical contact violated Catholic morality. It took a personal letter from Pope Pius VII to convince her that marital intimacy was acceptable, though she insisted on praying before each encounter. Despite these elaborate preparations, Ferdinand and Maria Josefa never produced children. The young queen died of fever in 1829 at just 25 years old, leaving Ferdinand a widower for the third time. The pattern was becoming clear. Ferdinand's wives didn't just die young, they died broken, traumatized by their experiences with Spain's most perverted king. Ferdinand's reign was marked by constant betrayal and political opportunism. In 1820, a liberal uprising forced him to accept the constitution once again. Ferdinand publicly declared, "Let us march, and me first, down the constitutional path." But privately, he was already plotting with foreign powers to restore absolute rule. True to form, Ferdinand called upon the Holy Alliance to invade Spain and crush the constitutional government. In 1823, the 100,000 Sons of St. Louis, a French army, marched into Spain and restored Ferdinand to absolute power. The king's revenge was swift and brutal. Rafael del Riego, the liberal officer who had led the 1820 uprising, was publicly hanged in Madrid's Plaza de la Tebada. Hundreds of other liberals were executed or driven into exile. Ferdinand's final marriage to his niece Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies in 1829 was purely calculated. He chose her not for love, but because she had already proven her fertility. Finally, at age 45, Ferdinand managed to produce surviving children, 2 daughters, but even this apparent success would become another source of national catastrophe. With no male heir, Ferdinand faced a succession crisis. Spanish law followed the Salic law, which prevented women from inheriting the throne. This meant Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos, would become king, but Ferdinand, in his final act of selfishness, secretly changed the succession laws to allow his daughter Isabella to inherit. This decision would plunge Spain into decades of civil war. When Ferdinand VII died on September 29, 1833, he left behind a legacy of unparalleled destruction. Under his rule, Spain had lost virtually all of its American colonies. The country was bankrupt, divided, and traumatized by years of repression. His decision to change the succession laws triggered the Carlist Wars, a series of brutal civil conflicts that would ravage Spain for generations. But perhaps Ferdinand's most damning legacy was the complete betrayal of his people's trust. The Spanish had fought and died for El Deseado, believing he would bring freedom and prosperity. Instead, they got a perverted tyrant whose physical abnormalities were matched only by his moral deformities. Ferdinand VII's story is more than just a tale of royal excess. It's a cautionary reminder of how power corrupts, and how the most dangerous tyrants are often those who present themselves as victims. The man who had been hailed as Spain's savior became its destroyer, leaving behind a trail of broken wives, shattered institutions, and a nation in ruins. In the end, Ferdinand VII achieved a kind of immortality, but not the kind any ruler would want. History remembers him not as El Deseado, but as El Rey Felon, the felon king. His name became synonymous with treachery, perversion, and the abuse of power. The most humiliating secret of Europe's most perverted king wasn't just his grotesque anatomy, it was his complete moral bankruptcy, hidden behind a facade of royal dignity. The next time you walk through the corridors of power, remember Ferdinand VII. Remember how easily a nation's hopes can be betrayed by those who claim to represent them. And remember that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are those who wear crowns.